Public Affairs and Communications Director at Greater Spokane Incorporated, which means I handle all the government affairs work and communication, marketing, and PR. And I am going to have, sorry, I just had to start with that. We were going to do introductions. And I'll start with Todd, introductions. So I'm just going to have them introduce themselves, talk about what the type of work that they do. Go ahead, Todd.
Hi, my name is Todd McKellips. I'm the Executive Director for the Washington Tiny House Association and also the State Chapter Leader for the American Tiny House Association on a national effort. And also I'll be bringing some opinions into this, being a manager of a manufactured housing community in Puyallup, Washington called Bowman Hilton.
Thank you. Courtney.
And I'm Courtney Williams, and I'm the Associate Director for Homes First, and it's a nonprofit property management company in Thurston County, and we also own homes in Mason County as well.
Okay. And Mike.
Hi, my name is Mike Kingsall. I'm the Executive Director of a national coalition called Up for Growth, which is a broad and diverse coalition that focuses on promoting more housing for the communities that need it the most. And we're based in Washington, D.C.
Great, thank you. So I was excited to moderate this panel, really looking at this issue. As we all know, it is a crisis issue that's been discussed numerous times today, from a federal and really a state level and a local level as well. So we'll just get right down to it. And this is just really context setting. I felt that I needed this as well, so I asked the three of them when I spoke with them last week. Is the West Coast, I mean, we hear about West Coast housing crisis from Washington, Oregon, and California. Is this simply a West Coast thing or not? And we'll start with you, Mike.
Sure, thanks. Absolutely not. Up for Growth National Coalition came together last year to really study the depth and breadth of the housing crisis nationwide. And what we found in doing our initial research was that the housing shortage across the country spans 23 states, including Washington, D.C. So it really the shortage touches all four corners of the country. We have way more household formation than housing unit production if we look at the recent history, and that's particularly acute in states like California, Oregon, and certainly Washington. To give sort of national frame and historic frame to this, if you go all the way back to the 1960s, the U.S. as a whole produced about 1.1 homes for every one household formed. More recently, at least here in Washington State, that ratio is lower than the national historic average, dropping to about one home for every one household formed, which is barely treading water when you take into account economic obsolescence and frictional vacancy over time. More recently, since 2010, since the global financial crisis, Washington State in particular has fallen to about 66 homes built for every 100 households formed. So we're really in a period where we're systematically underproducing housing relative to housing need. But while the housing crisis is particularly acute here in Washington State, it's symptomatic of a broader national shortage of housing. Nationally, we're 7.3 million homes short. In Washington State, we're about 226,000 homes short as measured from 2000 to 2015. And putting that relative to our total inventory of housing across the state, we're missing about 7.5% of our total existing housing stock as of 2015, and compared to a national average of about 5.4% underproduction relative to total housing stock. So while it's definitely more severe in the Western U.S., it's symptomatic of a broader national housing shortage and affordability crisis.
So even if no one moved to Washington State, we'd be well underwater in housing supply.
Most certainly.
Do either of you want to add to that?
So I'll just add quickly, and I'll just piggyback off. You said a great answer, and it's really in depth, that rural communities are heavy in Washington State. We have 30 out of 39 counties that are rural in Washington State. And that brings up a whole different housing crisis explanation and logistics that we really have to be thinking about. And that's unlike back east, because a lot of the cities back east are metropolitan, so the homelessness looks different. And so when we're thinking about homelessness, we have to really understand that it looks different everywhere, and while it's not unique, affordable housing as a nation, we're in a crisis. And everyone knows that, everyone is talking about it, but it's different in every area.
Thank you. And Todd?
Yeah, I feel like all over the world where there is a housing shortage, it's not just here. At the same time as we have uniqueness of what we have in Washington, we're lucky to have Amazon, we're lucky to have Microsoft here, and a lot of those companies I see as drivers. I did work property management here for Davis Property Management in Kirkland, and so I dealt with on a quite often basis basically there was always a housing shortage and a massive amount of people looking to move into the area and get into those homes. And everyone was telling me, well, we're being imported by these companies. And so obviously my investors and everybody else were trying to get max dollar at the time, but then not to make them the bad guys, they were trying to make their mortgage payment and maybe a couple $100 more than that. So when you look at actually how much income they were actually making, it wasn't much more than their mortgage payments. Some of them were asking too much, and we would sit on top of a unit for 3 months and get to that point where we were like, it's the housing market isn't that hot. We need to move on this. But looking at units in 1972, I had a mobile home that I found an ad for. It was $3,500 when it moved into the park then. The cost of that unit today is around $40,000 to $50,000, and most of the people that buy them gut them completely and put new siding and all that, and they sell for $89,000 to $120,000 when they're fixed up like that. And then I call my friends in Florida, and they're like, well, I got a mobile home here for $15,000 that's practically brand new. So I'm like, there is a difference in cost, but the income is a lot lower than here. So when you take into consideration, I do believe that the problem is everywhere, but we have certain drivers here that definitely motivate the housing market to have less vacancy locally.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have heard a lot today about some of the drivers of our state housing shortage, really at all levels. And I'll just add, being from Spokane, something I didn't hear from any other area was water. And I was surprised by that because I know that in and around Spokane County, that is a huge driver for in our growth management arena, is we have concerns about water and having enough water. So I don't know if that's my ringer question. I didn't prepare them for this one.
Nice.
Is it have you heard of that in the work that you all do?
So I deal with water a lot. I know we have like $65 per unit hookup fees. And that's just like some people have left the state for a month and they come back and they're like, what's this charge? I didn't use any water, but that's what our local jurisdiction charges. And then as far as digging wells, that's been almost eliminated through some regulations. So I've been told by startup tiny house communities that have looked to do that it's extremely difficult and very costly to develop those communities. Then you go in the cities and then you're attaching to sewer hookups and you're paying those impact fees, which is extremely hard as well.
So what do each one of you what we've heard about is policy, workforce, land, affordability, that kind of thing. What is your take on why it's so hard for us to catch up?
Well, I think this is a very complex challenge that we face, right? It's multifaceted. It's not one singular reason. For instance, access to water, to your point, big issue out in Spokane. We're a national coalition of members around the country. And I know Reno, and then in Boise, Idaho, water access is a major impediment. But it's not just one impediment, and it's also not just about barriers to housing. We have a housing shortage, to be sure, that spans across the income spectrum. But I think of it almost as two separate and distinct housing crises that we're facing. On one hand, we have a shortage of housing at large that is more and more affecting folks throughout the income spectrum, from extremely low income households to moderate income households, and giving rise to this debate around how do we get more housing to serve the needs of an increasing population, whether that's driven by household formation broadly or job creation in particular in our growing cities. But we also have a problem of the left-hand side of the income distribution, so the bottom 20% of income-earning households who just can't afford any housing. And there we have a real gap as it relates to housing, affordable housing, resource and subsidy. And so I believe that we have to tackle both of these drivers of the housing crisis. You can't do one without doing the other to get a full and robust solution to this challenge.
Do you have something, Todd? You look like you have something to say.
No, he's very correct. Decrease in vacancy basically, rises the cost of housing overall. I was in HUD at HUD recently at the National Mall doing an innovative housing showcase, and they were talking about basic cost of housing. 25% is impact fee based. And when you look at paying that up front, it obliterates, you used to be able to move to this country and just find some land on a handshake and build, and we can't do that anymore. And then we have the government coming in and saying, you have to pay these costs up front, which has eliminated investing. I know lots of people that would like to be homeowners and just can't get there at all because of those costs. But HUD wants to get out of the way. They want the motivation, the drivers to be the people that need homes. But cities have a desire to work with certain categories of housing that are cool, but manufactured housing and stuff like that. They've since the 1980s have cut back majorly on development of those communities, and modular housing is as good as normal housing right now as far as factory built structures. What got me into tiny houses was just trying to find loopholes. Tiny houses on wheels was a way to avoid paying impact fees, was a way to avoid paying all this, but at the same time was living in an RV. So we took it on to legalize them, but now we're going to be paying impact fees most likely. And so I'm worried that we're repeating the same thing by being legal now. We're being stuck in a rock and a hard place. But time and application process, cities bragging about how long it takes to, I've heard a California city was actually bragging in the media about how long they were dragging out permit processes for homes and how much it was costing the developer. And so that's something we need to work on. But I want to really push on workforce housing. I think that's the biggest thing we need. Microsoft, a great sponsor of this event, they can get into housing development. It's going to be key, I think, in the future.
So, full disclosure, I am very new when it comes to affordable housing. I come from workforce development, so I'm pretty skilled in that area, pretty knowledgeable. And it seems to me that when I got into the arena, the housing crisis arena, affordable housing, I'm with a nonprofit, and so that's really my focus. I'm seeing the main issue while we're talking about, the individuals that are cost burdened. 51% in our state are cost burdened. That means 50% of individuals are spending over 30% of their income on rent. That is asinine. But the other part of this is that the funding for affordable housing and for nonprofits who help individuals get and maintain affordable housing is that it is completely fragmented. And so it's coming from this pot and this pot and this pot. And when that happens, duplication of dollars happens, and then resources aren't being used adequately or strategically. And with workforce development, there's actually workforce development councils, and there's, I think, 11 in the state of Washington. And so they get together, they understand their region. So, for example, Workforce Development Council, I'm from Thurston County, they have 5 counties, so Lewis, Mason, Grays, other ones that I'm not remembering. But they have counties and they're representing that region, and they're region specific. And so the funds of that region goes to the development council, and it trickles down to the areas that need it the most. And this is federal, state, and local. And it's brilliant because it makes so much sense, and it helps individuals and regions communicate more appropriately, because us and Todd and I are putting you on the spot. We're not going to be popular. But Todd and I are talking when we're on this panel and we're in the audience, we're hearing Seattle talk about not having a lot of money for things that they need to get accomplished. Well, in Lewis County and Thurston County, we say, Seattle, you have all the money. And so the Workforce Development Councils, and what I hope we get is a Housing Development Council to help govern and help us steer these conversations, lessening the fragmenting of financial funds, and really helping service providers do their jobs and serve individuals and help individuals maintain their affordable homes.
I'm glad I don't have an opinion now. That's wonderful.
Yeah, we don't have opinions.
No.
No, I think it's a valuable perspective that all three of you provide. And so let's dig into, so how do, we know we need more housing at all levels, low income, affordable. I like the way that Mike discusses, instead of workforce, he calls it something different, and I'll let him tell you that. But how do we? You all three have kind of a different sector that you deal with, and so how do we beef up those sectors? And I really like your idea, Courtney, of the Housing Development Councils, much like what we do with workforce.
One other thing, again, sorry, I'm not trying to dominate the conversation, but something else, so how do we get to the root of this, and how do we solve this crisis? And I think, and I was talking to Andrew Barkus about this, I think when we come to the table, we really have to come to the table and remove ego from the conversation. And so when we're at this table and we're talking about affordable housing, our opinion and our agenda needs to be at the door, and we really have to talk about the problem. And we have to understand that we might not have any gain from the outcome of that conversation. So we might not get something from that conversation. But if we're in this profession and we are here because we care, and I know all of you do, otherwise you wouldn't spend 10 hours listening to people talk at you, then we have to be able to do that. And I mean, I might not win sometimes, affordable housing nonprofits might not win sometimes, but the bottom line is individuals who need this, so families, single individuals, there's a shortage there, at least in Thurston County and Lewis County and Mason. The individuals who are aging, et cetera, individuals with disabilities, individuals who are recovering from recovering.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be able to think of them and put them in the middle of the conversation instead of our own game. So removing ego is my recommendation.
Thank you.
Empathy has been key in this. I came from a very Republican conservative background, very, very religious, and so I kind of kept that attitude going into politics and different things that I got involved with. But one time I was encouraged by a mentor of mine to go and solve some world problems. And I realized from my own life, housing was always a problem, a multi-generational problem. And even with having good jobs and everything, came layoffs for my dad. And so it resulted in a thought process that was like, wow, there is an actual problem here, and I'm going to go investigate it, which really threw my mind for a loop when I started finding out some of the things I had originally thought were the way it was weren't the way it was. I've heard it said that most homeless people have a drug addiction problem. Well, I like to surprise everybody and say most homeless people are maybe actually living in another home right now. There's multiple generations living under one roof. And that goes on to say we have generations living under one roof. We have people getting creative and living in RVs. I would classify those people as homeless. A lot of them are my tenants in my community. I have 31 RVs in my community as is right now. It's forced some people to get creative with tiny houses, with looking at their solutions at building a house on wheels and putting a bathroom and doing all this. It kind of reminds you of an RV, but it's an actual house. It gives them the comfort of that. So, and actually going and serving the homeless and actually talking to them and saying, would you be willing to pick up a hammer and go swing some, and what caused you to be homeless, and finding out that it was a death in the family. It really triggered something, and they're a little bit, they're struggling with that. So, going out and serving and trying, that's the only reason I'm on stage here is because I took that effort to go out and find out what was going on. And, I still have arguments sometimes or discussions with people and try to keep it drama free on, they're a councilman, or they're working in the city, and they have their opinion, but it's based different. I've gone out and actually done this service, but when you look at, people are working multiple jobs right now when 10, 20 years ago, they may have not had to do that to get by. So I challenge everybody that we have a sector of homeless people that are housed but are struggling. They're at 50 to 80% AMIs, and it's not affordable. And even I've talked to bankers who've said that during the 2008 crisis, where they were giving out the loans to people who couldn't afford them, they're still doing that today. There's people with EBT cards getting house loans that are on variable loans that are scared of losing their homes, and it's a little bit of a scary thing. Yeah.
No, I think that's good. And you bring up 2008, so I'm in a former life, I was a banker for 15 years, and so I'm deeply familiar with kind of everything that went into that. And it seems that now we have today we have a shortage of homes, but really low unemployment. While 10 years ago, we had ample supply of homes, but high unemployment. So what has changed? How is that reversed, really?
Yeah, I think there's a real confluence of trends coming to a head, both here in Washington State and also nationwide. For one, we are experiencing the largest migration since World War II, this time back to the cities. And we're experiencing a dramatic shift both in demographic demand for housing, household configuration, and consumer preference generally for walkable urban neighborhoods and living environments. And so that's one. Number two, we are running up against barriers codified in local zoning code, exclusionary zoning, where the vast majority of residential zone land in many of our growing American cities, from Seattle to Portland to Minneapolis, are largely reserved for large lot, single family homes with a lot of requirements that ensure that nothing other than large lot, single family homes are able to be legally built. And so I think this confluence of folks coming back to the cities with a lot of limitations as to how many homes can be delivered to meet that increasing demand is creating this severe housing shortage that we're talking about. And so I feel like in terms of what's different in 2019 versus 2009 is that we don't have a housing crisis that's driven by a bubble. We don't have a housing crisis that's driven by excessive lending. We have a housing crisis that's driven by a lack of homes. We just have a housing shortage. And so I think that is the policy priority that's really coming to the fore, and obviously featured in a lot of the discussions today, is we have to get at those barriers and enable enough housing to meet contemporary housing need, both in terms of the type of housing as well as the quantity of housing.
Yeah. And I'll add to that, so I completely agree with you, Mike. But again, coming from workforce development, unemployment is historic. It's low right now in Washington State, and it's great on paper. But when you look at the wage growth, housing prices has grown twice the rate of wages. And so on paper it looks great, and that's probably why we might get a little ignored. But it's not. Individuals cannot afford to work or afford to keep a home. A lot of times when I was in my office, I would see individuals who would get them a sustainable job, and they would be making $17 an hour. And they would come back 4 months later because they became homeless because they couldn't afford their home any longer. And so that's a real problem. So while it looks great, it's absolutely not. And we really have to have that conversation.
Since when? It's been a 2-to-1 ratio.
Since 2016 was when my statistic was pulled.
Well, that's actually interesting that you bring that up. We pulled the data earlier today for Washington State, actually Seattle. So if you look at new at 112% of area median income. So we've seen, this is a national trend, a decoupling of income growth over time versus unit affordability or rent or home price over time. And the other thing that's striking is that it's not just renter households that are cost burdened. You mentioned 50%, but in Washington State, 25% of homeowner households are cost burdened, and that's despite having, in many cases, a fixed interest rate mortgage. And so, this is the result of think of broken housing ecosystem, as Congressman Heck says. These aren't unrelated issues, and there are downstream impacts from having a housing crisis on the multifamily rental side and having that lack of access to first-time home ownership opportunities or cost burdening on a home ownership side as well.
Yeah, I found a report from 2008 from Pierce County that basically they were trying to eliminate manufactured housing communities, and I was like, what? And in the report, the third party that they hired to do the case study actually came back and said, no, we're about to go into a housing crisis. You need to do something, and you need to keep these manufactured housing parks, and you need more. And so the county council voted and said, okay, let's do this. And so they outlined the areas where the zones would be for these manufactured housing parks, and there were already parks there or undevelopable land. I looked into it and I'm like, wow, this report, they did nothing to move it forward, not to slam the people that were on the council back then, but some people made the decision that, okay, we can have it in these outskirt areas without actually doing any investigative work, making sure they were on transit lines and stuff like that. So, those kind of things were motivating, trying to figure out what's going on here. Like, there's definitely discrimination going on towards certain housing types. Recently, I confronted the city of Lakewood and I said, hey, your policy is only to allow modular housing in manufactured housing community. What gives? And aren't you afraid you're going to get sued? And they said, yeah, we're about to change our policy because we know this stuff is coming down the line. So, I'm a tiny house guy, but I'm really pushing for any sort of affordable housing that it, can be in existence. But that being said, I lived in Graham and I commuted to corporate Costco in Issaquah for over a year, and 3 hours there, 3 hours back. It was just horrendous to save on cost to live out, to be where I could afford a place, basically. And I have constant discussions with people saying, oh, you could just live, in Eatonville or move outwards and you'll find something affordable. And I challenge them, look at Craigslist, look online and try to find something that was in that $650 range. There's nothing there when there was back in 2006, because that's when maybe they saw that there was those ads, but they're not there anymore. And to give a prime example of a house for sale, I just did an ad for a lady. I run a print company, and we did an ad, and I went on her website and I said, hey, your ad says it's sold. And she goes, oh, that was the 2016 sale I did for the same house. Well, it had sold for $160,000, and it's right near the Tacoma Dome in Tacoma, and $160,000 in 2016. It went for $450,000 just a month ago and had multiple offers. So you look at stuff like that. Yeah, I had new paint on it, had new floors, but maybe $20,000 in an actual work done to it, and sold for that much more. I mean, there's an obvious problem there.
Right. Well, isn't Tacoma the hottest?
The hottest market
in the United States.
Yeah.
And to exacerbate the problem, really, I think with tiny homes, maybe you can answer, and mobile homes. I'm not sure that it's pretty difficult to get a mortgage on those as well, to finance those.
Yeah, HUD was saying that their Fannie Mae is working on it. They're changing their policies right now to start moving towards, because it's a title product, so they're going to start opening up loans for lower, like around $50,000 is what I'm hearing as well. They're going to go lower. They're going to remove floor space requirements. So all that's coming down the line, because we have 200 square foot apartments now, micro apartments in Seattle, and they were basically illegal until House Bill 1085 passed and said you could do that. And so certain efforts have been made at the state legislative level. Where I see hope coming down the horizon, but I want to warn people, we got to keep talking about it. We got to keep pushing for it, because 2008, Pierce County was warned this was coming, and they, made a little bit of effort, but it wasn't what was needed.
So I do want to leave some time for questions at the end too, but I want each of you to we've talked a lot about barriers today in different panels and things like that, to really understand the nature of the issue that we're dealing with. But what is your best idea to kind of get us past those barriers? And I know it's a lot to ask, but what is one of your awesome ideas?
So something that became really real for me, so my partner and his family are from Paradise, California, and if you aren't aware, the town completely burned to the ground this past November. And something that was apparent, so they were a town that was a retirement community and then lower income individuals, and so they were the working poor, so they were able to maintain their homes, but that was about it. And the jobs aren't high paying, they would have to go elsewhere. Well, when the fires happened, 30,000 individuals lost their homes and they became homeless. And what happened, the surrounding communities, I just called the mayor of Paradise just to like talk and see what was going on. And she had told me that the individuals who could afford to relocate to the surrounding areas, the prices went up crazy. So they went up astronomically. And so the individuals who could afford to do that, did that. But the individuals who could not afford that, which was majority of the community members, they are still displaced and they are still living in tents. There's other political reasons why that is, but they are still there. The other part of that is the city was completely run on septic tanks. And so there wasn't a lot of desire to fund and rebuild that community because they have septic tanks. And so they're kind of scratching their head at this point. And what dawned on me, we are a wildfire away from that kind of crisis. And we do not want to be that in that kind of crisis. We really have to put affordable housing in emergency management planning. And so that really has to be taken seriously, and we're not doing that. And I'm really hopeful that you guys can figure that out and work with me. And that alongside with having a housing development council, I think we would be able to get somewhere. I think we'd be able to be more strategic and help individuals because it's simple. It really is simple, and it's not overcomplicated. Because me being new to housing and affordable housing, I am still quite novice and I get lost in all the acronyms. But to me, that makes sense, and I think if it makes sense to me, it will make sense to many, many people. And if we can do that, I think that's a start.
You don't know what IRC means?
Todd and I aren't going to be friends anymore.
I'd like policies to be managed by one rule of thumb, and that is, will it cause harm? Will it? I was a former volunteer firefighter, and I've been there and done that, where I've seen, houses catch on fire, and we need to provide safety regulations in those areas. But the overregulation that we have currently in the state is just horrendous. I mean, I have people wanting to use solar, and they found a federal law that basically says that a place can't discriminate against solar panels. But we still have jurisdictions that are, and something like that's just pretty silly. Like, let's start moving towards the future a bit. But less regulation is a really good thing, especially in affordable housing. I think everybody on the panel agrees, no matter what side of the aisle you're on. We'd like to see us move forward with more affordable housing, and the way to get there, I think, is removing some of that. The other thing is, NIMBYism is immense in this country. I like the Rotary's little saying that says, it must be for the good of all. And that's for investors, that's for the government, that's for everybody. So let's make some efforts and decisions that are good for everyone. And as far as NIMBYism goes, I was in Washington, D.C., and they have a regional council there because they said anything that they would do would affect, Baltimore or whatever town around them. And I know we have a regional council here that there's some good people on it, but I definitely need to work more in the housing category and actually get them working in conjunction with each other, and we're making decisions together. That would be huge, but also opening up ideas for tiny houses. I'm really partial to that, but we need, we just made them legal in the state of Washington. Senate Bill 5383 allows them to be used in tiny house community settings and in mobile home parks. But when I reach out to local jurisdictions, it's almost like, well, that's a suggestion rather than law. And so, it's troublesome when, it's not the cure-all, it's not the silver bullet, as everybody said earlier. Not one thing is a silver bullet, but we can be making a conscious effort to follow law. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would just echo the rest of the group. I mean, I think, the Congressman Peck meeting with that coalition report, set out a good framework, which is land, labor, lumber, and lending, right? We talked about, I think, all 4 of those themes. I think our organization is particularly interested in getting at these structural impediments to housing that perpetuate lack of access to housing, particularly to lower income households, and that perpetuate an affordability crisis that is growing and impacting many more folks along that income spectrum. And I think, we've got to be more specific than just generally talking about artificial barriers to housing. The city of Austin, Texas actually recently passed a policy through its city council that thinks about those sorts of trades. So getting at impediments to housing vis-a-vis restrictions on levels of density or onerous off-street parking requirements that mean that you can't build as many dwelling units on a particular site. And they were actually interestingly able to craft a policy that both got at a requirement for affordable homes, so a set-aside requirement, in exchange for accessing density bonuses and loosening of some of these other requirements, and that is calibrated in a way that so far seems to be successful and accepted by the housing producers in that market. So I think taking steps to really understand the limitations in each particular locality and what are the creative solutions and the specific solutions to get at those barriers to enable both more housing as well as the types of housing that are needed today is a real effective way to move the needle on this challenge.
Yeah, I agree. Creative ideas are I think really are what we're looking for.
Innovation.
So now we'll have some creative questions. We'll open it up for questions. Yes, ready for the front.
I'm a pretty loud talker, so Claire Hendricks with the Northwest Credit Union Foundation. We work across 3 states, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, so we see this, I think, just about everywhere in these conversations. And one thing you kind of touched on briefly, Todd, I think we're also starting to see a lot of businesses starting to enter the space and give their voice in terms of lobbying for regulatory changes and also housing options. So what have you guys seen here in Washington, and what role do you see kind of non-housing based businesses play and try to move some of the momentum on this issue?
Do you have anything?
Well, I can jump in. So Up for Growth is a broad coalition of stakeholders. So not just builders of housing or owners of housing, but all sorts of affected stakeholders, including major employers. And I think the one thing that the business community can most certainly do in this conversation is lend its voice as solutions are advocated for at the local level. I'll give you a great example here locally is Microsoft announced the $500 million commitment to affordable housing, but it's not just the affordable housing bank or lending program, it's also significantly leaning in on policy. And among other things, Microsoft joined Up for Growth in other organizations in supporting the appropriation ultimately of $175 million into the state's housing trust fund, as well as several specific pieces of legislation, whether that's condo defect liability reform, or even the extension of the multifamily tax exemption program. So I think simply the voice of major employers in the market and lending that voice to support specific solutions, I think that's a way that business has begun to use its power, and I think should continue to use its voice to move solutions.
And also, though, I think we all have skin in the game when it comes to affordable housing. Those businesses have employees that might not be able to make ends meet and might not be able to afford a home. And so really advocating for that. And I think a lot of employers want to do the right thing. A lot of employers want to pay their individuals enough to be able to afford a home. It's just really not the reality at this point.
Yeah, I was quite shocked how many groups came along and actually said, we're going to pay a lobbyist. I was actually told at one time I needed to pay a lobbyist to make tiny homes legal in Washington State. And I said, I don't have the money, so I'm going to go do it myself. But then, Tesla came along and said, we have a lobbyist. We're going to have them working for you. Department of Veterans Affairs, they have a lobbyist, and they said they'd support our efforts, and I even sat down with the governor's office before we went in. I said, do I have your support? Because I don't know what I'm doing. and they were laughing at me and saying, yeah, we wouldn't even be meeting with you if you were one of these high cost lobbyists. I don't know if that was a joke or not, but at the same time, there was multiple groups that came forward that started, homeless advocacy groups, Tacoma Public Schools. They have tiny home clubs, and they have recognized that there's housing problems everywhere. So a lot of people got on the bandwagon and started helping us out. But that being said, Ray Kroc from McDonald's, went into real estate. Like, he wasn't about making burgers at all. So I'm like, why aren't these huge IT companies and everybody else buying up real estate, building high-rise buildings, giving people the benefit of not workforce housing? I keep saying that, but a benefit housing, like you get it as an added benefit. It doesn't come out of your paycheck, so it doesn't make you a slave. You can go to another company that offers you a better house. So, I see those kind of things making a huge effort to change things in our society culturally.
And just one more thing to piggyback off of that. Affordable housing, the conversation is really interesting, because I think there's a misunderstanding. Affordable housing and individuals who are homeless it's not the same conversation.
Exactly.
And so I really, as individuals, as stewards of the mission of affordable housing, I ask that you help clear up that misconception, because I think that will really help matters, because it gets overlooked and affordable housing gets wiped under homelessness. And that in itself, that scares people, because that's a huge problem and people don't even want to touch that. And so that's frightening. So we really have to divide and start solving more strategically and help clearing that message up.
I agree.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. All right, well, I have another one for the panel then. You mentioned Austin,
Yes.
Mike, and I was going to mention Austin because I vacationed there in November, and it just surprised me. It felt like the zoning was different than anywhere that I've been, because there were tiny homes in backyards and things like that, whether it was mother-in-law kind of apartments or multifamily, really true multifamily dwelling. But what cities have done this right? Who has had success? We heard about Houston from a different angle a little earlier in the earlier panel, but what city or area do you think has done a good job at incentivizing and being creative about housing options?
I don't think there's any single city that has it all figured out, but I do think that there are places that have discovered or innovated in different elements of a needed solution. So, an example would be the state of Oregon, which just about a week and a half ago moved some legislation that legalizes duplexes, triplexes, quads, and high opportunity single family neighborhoods statewide. That's when I was speaking with earlier today, analogized it to HOV lanes, right? So if you have 2 or 3 occupants in the car, if a lot of people adopt that, you're freeing up that you're actually creating some efficiencies, and I think there's part of that there, but I also think it's an innovation around freeing up supply and creating housing opportunities in areas that are particularly high opportunity, with great schools, with great cultural and neighborhood resources. They create better economic mobility outcomes, again, for lower income households, who hopefully should be able to find spots and affordable housing options in these areas. So that's part of the solution. I think there are really great examples on inclusionary housing programs across the U.S. that are calibrated quite well. I think there's a lot to be said about Seattle's implementation of mandatory housing affordability. While not perfect, certainly any policy can be improved. I think that the combination of the density bonuses in exchange for reasonable set-asides of affordable homes, as well as
in the fee has created a dynamic where housing production is still happening, and the housing production that is happening is mixed income, creates opportunity for both low-income households as well as households seeking market rate apartment units. So I think that there are many examples. Those are two, and I think that it takes a lot of different creative solutions all cobbled together appropriate to any local community to really get at the comprehensive solution that's needed.
So I looked into this because that was a question that I didn't really know the answer to. And there's several areas in the United States that are doing things right. Philadelphia has set aside money in the city, so government got involved and set a pool and said this is all for affordable housing. So they raised like $6 million and they were able to provide some affordable housing. So there's all of these little ideas and that do big things, that really do help people. But the bottom line is comprehensive plans that Mike just was mentioning don't often include the full array of options of affordable housing. So tiny homes are often not included, ADUs are often not included. And so really helping individuals, constituents, empower them to understand what needs to be entailed, or what needs to be included into a comprehensive plan, and help get that drafted and get that implemented. The other thing is, so I'm with Homes First, and so I'm gonna do a little shout out to Homes First because we are a non-profit property management company. We are partnering with a private sector property management company with an 82-unit complex in Olympia, Washington. And so, because we both realized, we got to the table and both realized we can help one another out significantly. And that's what we're going to do. And so, more to come on that. We're piloting it, so I'll share updates later. But the prediction is it's going to be optimistic. The prediction is that this is absolutely needed and it's going to work because we both need each other and we both can find value in one another's strengths and assets. So, yeah, I'm pleased.
As far as places that have just gone and basically been on the grassroots side of making things happen and making things happen quick would be the Austin, Texas. There's Denver, Colorado area as well. It's been adapting things. Maine, Tennessee, as far as states, but Tennessee was one of the last ones to start adapting stuff. And people were working on it for 3 to 5 years, and it adapted quickly. Austin, Texas ones, they were in production, I think, from the time they got the sale of the land to actually full production was like 6 months, I think. They were actually putting tiny homes there, and those tiny homes were in around $150,000. Really modern, really cool looking. It's called Constellation ATX, is ATX.com is the website. But so what I notice is that all these other places move really quick, and Washington State moves very slow. So I'm here, dedicate my life actually to solving homelessness, and I don't talk about the homeless on the side of the road a lot because I do believe it's more of a top-down effect. We need to take care of our police officers, our firefighters, our nurses, CNAs, working class people that are barely able to get by right now. Once we start solving that, it's going to have a trickle-down effect to where people that just got out of jail can actually afford a place. Right now, we have a cycle going on where people get out of domestic violence care centers, and they don't even have proper housing there. And there's lots of different groups starting up and getting going, and that's exciting. But when we're talking 100,000 unit shortage, just I think in Pierce County alone, and 250 in King County, Seattle alone, we're looking at an effort here that's a little bit bigger than just the tents on the side of the road. And the places that are doing it right are getting rid of red tape and flying through it because people in the community are realizing this is something important. The Ording Veterans Village, a tiny home community village there, I mean, it's going on 2 years, and it's not even about the NIMBYs per se, but it's like, oh, we have this last hurdle we got to get through. We didn't realize up front. And that being said, I want to encourage counties and permit offices and all that to start actually putting in writing permission for things. Because I've had people going and buying land and saying, yeah, you can put a tiny home here and all this. And then they find out after they've spent $20,000 or $50,000 on the tiny house that it wasn't allowed. But the cities won't give you written permission anymore because of liability, and counties won't even send you an email back saying that you can do something. And so I think there's an effort there that needs to be done on a state or a local level that pushes that down a bit so that people can actually get a black and white, yes, you can do something or not answer when it comes to any housing development.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank
Stop.
you very much. I know. Thank you.
Yeah.